The auctioneer's voice cracked against the desert heat, his gavel worn smooth from years of selling things that weren't meant to be sold. Margaret stood at the back of the crowd, her thin fingers clutching 2 quarters that represented everything. She had left in the world. She hadn't come here to buy anyone. She'd come because the 50 cents in her palm was supposed to be for bread, and bread meant another day of surviving in a world that had already taken her husband, her home, and her hope. But when she saw the man in chains, something inside her chest twisted in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town square in Millbrook baked under the Arizona sun, dust swirling between the boots of men who had gathered not for commerce, but for spectacle. Margaret pressed herself against the weathered post of Henderson's General Store, watching the crowd with the careful eyes of someone who had learned that being invisible was often the difference between safety and suffering. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the fabric offered little protection from either the heat or the stares that occasionally drifted her way. 3 months had passed since Thomas died, 3 months since the bank had come for their small farm outside town, 3 months since she'd become just another widow with empty pockets and nowhere to go. The boarding house where she now lived charged $1 a week for a room barely larger than a closet, and Mrs. Garrett, the landlady, had made it clear that sympathy didn't extend to late payments. Margaret's sewing brought in just enough to keep a roof over her head, but barely enough for food. The 50 cents in her hand was meant for a loaf of bread and maybe some beans, enough to stretch through the next few days until Mrs. Patterson needed more mending done, but she couldn't leave. Not yet. The auction block stood in the center of the square, a crude platform built from rough planks that had seen too many transactions like this one. Sheriff Coleman stood to one side, his star catching the light as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't comfortable with what was happening here. Margaret could see that in the tight line of his mouth. But comfort and law were different things entirely in territorial Arizona. Next item, called Jeremiah Caldwell, the auctioneer whose voice carried the authority of a man who had never questioned whether something should be sold, only how much it might fetch. Caldwell was a thin man with sharp features and sharper eyes, the kind who could calculate profit in his sleep. He'd come up from Tucson specifically for this sale, and everyone knew he took a percentage of whatever changed hands. 2 men emerged from the small jail that served Millbrook, dragging between them someone who moved with careful, measured steps despite the iron shackles around his ankles. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had expected to see a broken spirit, the defeated posture of someone resigned to their fate. Instead, the Apache warrior walked with a dignity that the chains couldn't touch, his back straight, his head high, his dark eyes scanning the crowd. Not with fear, but with the quiet assessment of someone who had faced worse things than this and survived. He was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 30, with long black hair that fell past his shoulders and skin bronzed by years under the desert sun. His clothes were simple, a cotton shirt and leather pants that had seen better days, but they were clean. Someone had made sure of that, though Margaret couldn't imagine why such a detail would matter to the men who had brought him here. "This here's the one they call Running Wolf," Caldwell announced, consulting a piece of paper in his hand. "Captured 3 weeks ago after that business down near Canyon Ridge. The territorial governors decided he's to be sold into service rather than..." The auctioneer let the alternative hang in the air. Everyone knew what happened to Apache warriors who weren't sold. Strong back, used to hard work. The army says he speaks good English. The starting bid is $5. Margaret watched the faces in the crowd. There was Jake Morrison, who owned the largest ranch in the county and had the look of a man calculating how much work he could extract from human muscle. Behind him stood the Garrett brothers, known for their tempers and their treatment of the Mexican workers who labored in their fields. Near the front, she recognized Samuel Wright, whose farm bordered what had once been her land, a man whose wife had died the previous winter, and who might be looking for someone to tend his house and children. $5, came a voice from the middle of the crowd. Morrison, as expected. 6, countered the elder Garrett brother. Margaret found herself studying the warrior's face as the bidding began. Running Wolf stood perfectly still, but she could see the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands, shackled at the wrists, occasionally flexed and relaxed. He was listening, understanding every word, calculating the kind of life that awaited him with each new bid. $7, said Samuel Wright, and something shifted in Running Wolf's expression. Margaret had heard the stories about Wright's place, how he worked his hired hands from dawn to well past dusk, how his children had grown thin and quiet since their mother's death. The bidding continued, each increment adding weight to the chains that bound the warrior to this moment. Margaret watched Wright's face grow more determined as the price climbed. She'd seen that look before, the expression of a man who had decided he was going to own something, regardless of the cost. $10, Wright called out, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who knew he had deeper pockets than most of the men present. The crowd grew quieter. $10 was more than many of the farmers made in a month. Margaret felt her stomach clench as she calculated what that amount of money could mean. $10 would pay for her room for more than 2 months. $10 could buy enough food to last her through the winter. $10 was a fortune to someone who counted her wealth in quarters. $10 going once, Caldwell announced, scanning the crowd for any other bidders. Morrison shook his head. The Garrett brothers stepped back, and Wright's smile grew wider, going twice. Margaret looked at Running Wolf one more time. He was staring directly at Wright now, and she could see something in his dark eyes that made her chest tighten. Not fear, exactly, but resignation. The kind of acceptance that came when someone realized their fate was being decided by strangers, who saw them as nothing more than a tool to be used. The warrior's gaze moved slowly across the crowd, taking in each face as if memorizing them. When his eyes met Margaret's, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, though they'd never met. Or maybe it was simply the acknowledgement between two people who understood what it meant to have their lives reduced to currency in someone else's hands. His lips moved, so slightly that Margaret almost missed it. But she was watching, and she was close enough to see him mouth a single word. Please. Not to the crowd. Not to Wright or the auctioneer or the sheriff. To her. And in that moment, Margaret realized that the 50 cents in her hand wasn't meant for bread after all. 50 cents, she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The crowd turned to look at her, confusion rippling through the assembled men. Caldwell frowned, cupping his ear as if he hadn't heard correctly. Ma'am? Margaret stepped forward, her legs unsteady but her voice growing stronger. 50 cents, that's my bid. Laughter erupted from several directions. Wright shook his head in amusement, and one of the Garrett brothers muttered something about fool women that made his companions chuckle. Ma'am, Caldwell said, his tone patronizing, the current bid is $10. 50 cents is ... Is what? I'm bidding, Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. She walked closer to the platform, still clutching her quarters. This is an auction, isn't it? I heard you say the starting bid was $5, but I didn't hear you say there was a minimum increment. Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably. He knew Margaret, had known her husband Thomas, and the look on his face suggested he wasn't entirely sure what to make of this development. Now see here, Wright called out, irritation creeping into his voice. This is ridiculous. $10 is my bid, and this woman clearly doesn't have that kind of money. Do you have 11? Margaret asked, turning to face him directly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Wright's face reddened. Of course I do, but that's not the point. You can't possibly. $12, Morrison suddenly interjected, his voice cutting through Wright's protests. If we're going to have theatrics, might as well make it interesting. 13, Wright countered immediately, his good humor evaporating entirely. Margaret watched the numbers climb, each bid pulling Running Wolf further away from whatever slim hope her 50 cents might have represented. But she didn't step back, didn't retreat to her place against the store wall. Instead, she remained where she was, holding her quarters and watching the warrior's face. He was looking at her again, and this time she was certain she saw something that might have been gratitude. Not because he thought she could win, but because someone in this crowd had seen him as more than property worth bidding on. $15, Wright declared, his voice carrying the finality of someone who intended to end this nonsense. The crowd fell silent again. $15 was serious money, more than most of these men saw in several months. Morrison shook his head and stepped back. The Garrett brothers had long since given up. $15, Caldwell repeated. Going once ... Margaret looked down at her 2 quarters, then back up at Running Wolf. The warrior was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between sadness and understanding. Going twice ... $15.50, Margaret said quietly. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. The ripples of shock and disbelief spread through the crowd, followed immediately by renewed laughter. But this time, the laughter had an edge to it, the kind that came when men felt their authority being questioned by someone they considered powerless. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ma'am, Sheriff Coleman said, stepping forward, I think maybe you should. I think maybe she should mind her own business, Wright snapped. This is absurd. $15.50? She doesn't have $15, much less $15.50. Margaret felt the weight of every eye in the square pressing down on her. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she didn't move. You're right, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I don't have $15. I have 50 cents. That's my bid. 50 cents. But Wright bid $15, Caldwell protested. And I'm bidding 50 cents, Margaret repeated. Unless there's a rule that says previous bids set a minimum for new ones? The auctioneer looked uncertain. This wasn't a situation covered in whatever manual he might have studied. He glanced at Sheriff Coleman, who shrugged helplessly. Ma'am, Wright said, his voice dripping with condescension, you clearly don't understand how auctions work. The highest bid wins. $15 is higher than 50 cents. I understand perfectly, Margaret replied. But I also understand that an auction continues until the auctioneer declares it closed. You bid $15, which was your right. I'm bidding 50 cents, which is mine. Running Wolf was staring at her now with an intensity that made her forget about the crowd, forget about the impossibility of what she was trying to do. In his dark eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: hope. This is insane, Wright muttered. But Margaret noticed he didn't immediately raise his bid. $15 was a lot of money, even for someone like him, and the idea of getting into a bidding war with a woman who clearly couldn't pay was starting to make him look foolish. $16, he said finally, but the confidence had gone out of his voice. Margaret nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. $16.50, she said. More laughter from the crowd, but it was different now. Some of the men were beginning to look uncomfortable, as if they were witnessing something that went beyond mere entertainment. Others seemed genuinely puzzled by what they were seeing. Wright's face was now deep red. Whether from the heat or anger, Margaret couldn't tell. $20, he said loudly. Let's end this foolishness. $20. The amount echoed. In Margaret's mind, a sum so far beyond her reach, it might as well have been 20,000. She felt her resolve waver for the first time since she'd opened her mouth. $20 would feed her for months, would pay her rent through the winter, would mean the difference between survival and starvation. She looked at Running Wolf again, and something in his expression stopped her retreat before it could begin. He wasn't looking at her with expectation anymore, but with something deeper. Understanding, perhaps. Or maybe simple acceptance that she had tried, which was more than anyone else had done. $20.50, she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. The square fell completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen next. Sheriff Coleman removed his hat and wiped his forehead, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Caldwell looked from Margaret to right and back again, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Right stared at Margaret for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and something that might have been grudging respect. Finally, he shook his head. "This is madness," he said. "Pure madness. But if that woman wants to throw away her money on some foolish gesture, let her." He turned and began pushing through the crowd. $25, he called over his shoulder. "And that's my final offer." Margaret felt the world tilt around her. $25. She might as well have been asked to bid on the moon and stars. Her hand tightened around her 2 quarters. The metal warmed from her palm, and she realized that this was where her impossible gambit would end. But then Running Wolf did something unexpected. He spoke. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. "Margaret Sullivan." The shock of hearing her name, her full name, spoken by this stranger in chains rippled through the crowd like lightning. Margaret felt her knees go weak. She stared at the warrior, her mind racing to understand how he could possibly know who she was. Wright had stopped walking and turned back, his face a mask of confusion. Sheriff Coleman took a step forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. Even Caldwell seemed to have forgotten about the auction, staring at Running Wolf with obvious bewilderment. "How do you ... Margaret began, but her voice failed her. Running Wolf looked directly at her, and for the first time since he'd been brought to the platform, he smiled. It was a small smile, sad and knowing, but real. "You brought water," he said simply. "To the reservation, 2 winters ago, when the children were sick." The memory hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had almost forgotten about that trip, one of the few times Thomas had convinced her to come with him when he delivered supplies to the Apache reservation north of town. There had been an outbreak of fever among the children, and the Indian agent had been nowhere to be found. Thomas had loaded their wagon with medical supplies and blankets, and Margaret had filled every container they owned with clean water from their well. She remembered a long line of sick children, their mothers holding them with the desperate love that transcended any difference in language or culture. She remembered ladling water into cup after cup, watching small faces brighten as they drank. She remembered the gratitude in parents' eyes, the way they had pressed her hands between theirs and spoken words she didn't understand but felt in her heart. "You saved my sister's boy," Running Wolf continued, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness. "Little Crow. He was burning with fever, and his mother had no water left. You gave him water and soup, and you sat with him when his mother collapsed from exhaustion." Margaret did remember now. A little boy, perhaps 4 years old, who had been so still she had feared he was dying. His mother, a young woman who couldn't have been much older than Margaret herself, had been swaying on her feet from days of caring for her sick child without rest. Margaret had taken the boy in her arms, spooned water and broth between his cracked lips, and sung the lullabies her own mother had sung to her when she was small. "He lived," Running Wolf said, and his voice was softer now, meant for her alone. "Despite the crowd that hung on every word, he's 6 now. He draws pictures of horses and asks his mother to tell him about the white woman who sang to him when he was dying." Tears ran down Margaret's cheeks, though she wasn't aware of crying. The memory of that child, of his mother's grateful embrace when the fever finally broke, of Thomas's proud smile as they rode home in their empty wagon, filled her chest with a warmth she hadn't felt since her husband's death. "You knew my name," she whispered. "Thomas Sullivan," Running Wolf said, nodding. "He spoke of you often when he came to the reservation. Said you had the gentlest hands and the strongest heart of anyone he'd ever known. Said you could see the person inside anyone, no matter what the world had done to them." The crowd was murmuring now, a low buzz of conversation as men tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. Margaret heard fragments of words, pieces of judgment and confusion, but none of it mattered. She was looking at Running Wolf, this warrior in chains who remembered her kindness from 2 years ago, who somehow knew exactly who she was despite everything that had changed since then. $25.50, she said, the words coming out steady and sure despite the tears on her face. Wright threw his hat on the ground. "Damn it all," he shouted. "This is insane. Sheriff, you can't let this continue. She doesn't have $25. Hell, she probably doesn't even have the original 50 cents she started with." Sheriff Coleman looked at Margaret, his expression troubled. "Ma'am, Mr. Wright does have a point, if you can't cover your bid." Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out her 2 quarters, holding them up for everyone to see. "I have 50 cents, she said clearly. "That's my bid. 50 cents. "But you just bid $25.50, Caldwell protested. "No," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I bid 50 cents. That's what I have, and that's what I'm offering. Mr. Wright can bid whatever he wants, but my bid is 50 cents. The logic was impossible, infuriating, and somehow irrefutable. Wright sputtered. Caldwell shook his head in confusion, and several men in the crowd began laughing again, though now it seemed less like mockery and more like amazement at the sheer audacity of what they were witnessing. Running Wolf was still looking at Margaret, and she could see something in his eyes that she recognized because she felt it too. Not love, exactly not yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition between 2 people who had both lost everything and found themselves in a place they'd never expected to be, facing a choice that would define the rest of their lives. "Ma'am," Sheriff Coleman said gently, "I'm afraid this auction needs to proceed according to proper rules. Mr. Wright's bid of $25. "I withdrew my bid," Wright announced suddenly. Every head in the square turned toward him. He was standing with his arms crossed, his face still red, but his expression now one of disgust rather than anger. "I said I would withdraw my bid," he repeated. "If this town wants to turn a legal proceeding into some kind of circus act, I want no part of it. Let the woman have him for 50 cents. Let's see how long her Christian charity lasts, when she's got to feed him and house him and keep him from running back to his people." He pushed through the crowd and stalked away, leaving behind a vacuum of uncertainty. Caldwell looked around. Helplessly, clearly out of his depth. "Are there any other bids?" he asked weakly. Silence stretched across the square. No one moved, no one spoke. Margaret stood holding her 2 quarters, her heart hammering against her ribs, scarcely believing what was happening. 50 cents going once, Caldwell said, his voice barely audible. Margaret looked at Running Wolf. He was watching her with an expression of quiet amazement, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening either. "Going twice ... The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, final and irreversible. "Sold," Caldwell announced, though he sounded like he was announcing the end of the world rather than the conclusion of a business transaction. "To the lady in the back, for 50 cents. The crowd began to disperse immediately, men shaking their heads and muttering to each other as they wandered back to their daily business. Margaret stood frozen in place, still holding her quarters, still trying to process what she had just done. Sheriff Coleman approached her, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "Ma'am," he said quietly, I need to ask ... Do you understand what you've just committed to? Margaret looked at him, then at Running Wolf, who was still standing on the platform in his chains. I think, she said slowly, I'm about to find out. Margaret's hands shook as she counted out her 2 quarters into Caldwell's palm, the metal coins making tiny clicking sounds that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of the square. The auctioneer stared down at the money as if he'd never seen currency before, then looked back at her with an expression caught between bewilderment and something that might have been respect. Ma'am, he said slowly, I've been conducting auctions for 15 years, and I can honestly say I've never seen anything quite like this. Sheriff Coleman approached with a set of keys, the iron rings jangling softly as he walked toward the platform where Running Wolf still stood. The warrior hadn't moved since the gavel fell, his dark eyes fixed on Margaret with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. She realized suddenly that she had no idea what came next. In all her years of marriage to Thomas, she had never actually owned another human being, had never even considered what such a transaction would entail. Mrs. Sullivan, Coleman said, his voice gentle but official, I need to go over some things with you. The territorial law requires that I explain your responsibilities and his ... limitations. Margaret nodded, though she felt as if she were moving through a dream. Around them, the last of the crowd was dispersing, men heading back to their farms, and businesses with stories that would be told over dinner tables for weeks to come. She caught fragments of conversation as they passed. Fool woman. 50 cents. What's she thinking? But the words seemed to come from very far away. Coleman unlocked the shackles around Running Wolf's ankles first, the heavy iron falling away to land in the dust with a dull thud. The warrior flexed his feet, rolling his weight from one side to the other, and Margaret saw him wince slightly. The chains had left red marks around his ankles, and she found herself wondering how long he'd been wearing them. According to territorial statute, Coleman continued, working on the wrist shackles now, he's bound to you for a period of 7 years, or until such time as you choose to release him. During that time, he's required to work for you, live where you say, and not leave your property without permission. In return, you're responsible for his food, shelter, and basic care. The wrist shackles fell away, and Running Wolf brought his hands together in front of him, rubbing at the marks the iron had left. His fingers were long and graceful, Margaret noticed, the hands of someone who knew how to make things, how to work with tools and materials. There were calluses on his palms, old scars across his knuckles, but his nails were clean and carefully kept. 7 years, Margaret repeated, the weight of the commitment settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had bought this man's life for 50 cents, and now she was responsible for him for 7 years. The magnitude of what she'd done was beginning to sink in, and with it came a creeping sense of panic. What had she been thinking? She could barely feed herself, could barely afford the tiny room she rented. How was she supposed to care for another person? There's also the matter of the bond, Coleman added, consulting a paper he'd pulled from his pocket. Territorial law requires a $50 bond to ensure his good behavior. If he runs or commits any crimes, you're liable for that amount. $50. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She had just spent her last 50 cents on Running Wolf, and now she was being told she owed $50 she didn't have. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. Sheriff, she said quietly, I don't have $50. Coleman's expression softened. He'd known Thomas Sullivan, had respected him, and by extension had always treated Margaret with kindness. I figured as much, he said. Tell you what, I'll hold off on filing the bond paperwork for a week. Maybe you can work something out with Judge Martinez when he comes through town next. Margaret nodded gratefully, though she had no idea what she could possibly work out. Judge Martinez was known for his strict interpretation of territorial law, and she doubted he'd be sympathetic to a poor widow who'd gotten herself into a situation she couldn't afford. Running Wolf spoke for the first time since the auction ended. "I won't run," he said, his voice quiet but clear. He was looking directly at Margaret as he spoke, not at the sheriff. "You have my word." Coleman glanced between them, then shrugged. "Well," he said, "I suppose that's between you two to work out. Mrs. Sullivan, he's your responsibility now. I'd suggest you get him somewhere out of the sun before he collapses." Only then did Margaret notice the slight sway in Running Wolf's stance, the way he was holding himself carefully upright, despite what was obviously exhaustion. His shirt was stained with sweat, and there were lines of fatigue around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and little food. She wondered when he'd last eaten, when he'd last had water, when he'd last been allowed to rest. "Can you walk?" she asked him. He nodded, but she saw the effort it took to keep his expression neutral. "Where are we going?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Where were they going? Her room at Mrs. Garrett's boarding house was barely large enough for one person, and she was certain the landlady would have strong opinions about Margaret bringing home a man, especially an Apache warrior. Most of the town's residents would probably have similar objections. She realized she hadn't thought past the moment of winning the auction and hadn't considered the practical realities of what came next. I need to think," she said then. Felt foolish for admitting her uncertainty in front of the sheriff. "The boarding house where I live, it's not suitable." Running Wolf studied her face, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was reading more in her expression than she intended to reveal. "You don't have a place for me," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'll figure something out," Margaret said quickly, though she had no idea what that might be. "There's the old stable behind Henderson's store," Coleman suggested. "It's not much, but it's got a roof and walls. Henderson might let you use it for a few dollars." A few dollars. Margaret almost laughed at the impossibility of it all. She just spent her last money on Running Wolf, owed $50 she didn't have for a bond, and now needed to find several more dollars for shelter. The arithmetic of poverty was relentless and unforgiving. "I'll speak with Mr. Henderson," she said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. Coleman nodded and tipped his hat. "Good luck, Mrs. Sullivan and Running Wolf." He paused, looking at the warrior seriously. "I meant what I said about not running. This town's not known for its patience with Apache who break agreements." "I understand," Running Wolf replied. The sheriff walked away, leaving Margaret and Running Wolf standing alone in the square. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Margaret of the sunsets she used to watch from her front porch when Thomas was still alive. That life seemed impossibly distant, now separated from this moment, not just by time, but by a series of choices that had led her to this place, to this man, to this impossible situation. "Margaret," Running Wolf said softly, and the sound of her name in his voice made her look up at him. "Why did you do this?" It was a fair question, and one she'd been asking herself since the moment she'd opened her mouth to make that first bid. Why had she done it? She could have walked away, could have used her 50 cents for bread as planned, could have continued her quiet, difficult life without taking on the enormous responsibility of another person's welfare. "I don't know," she said honestly. "When I saw you up there, when you said please, I couldn't walk away." He was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "You know this will be hard for you, having me here. People won't understand." Margaret looked around the square, noting how the few remaining townspeople were giving them a wide berth, how conversations stopped when they walked past, how children were being pulled closer to their mothers. He was right, of course. This wouldn't just be difficult practically, it would be difficult socially. Millbrook was a small town with strong opinions about proper behavior, and a widow taking responsibility for an Apache warrior would definitely not be considered proper. "Let me worry about that," she said. They walked slowly toward Henderson's general store. Running Wolf's longer stride shortened to match her pace. Margaret found herself hyper-aware of the curious stares they attracted, the way conversations hushed. As they passed, Mrs. Patterson emerged from the seamstress shop and stared openly, her mouth slightly agape. Young Billy Crawford actually stopped in the middle of the street to gawk, earning a sharp word from his mother. Henderson's store occupied a corner lot on Main Street, its wooden sign creaking gently in the evening breeze. Margaret had shopped there regularly when she and Thomas lived on the farm, and occasionally since moving to town when she could afford Henderson's prices. The store owner was a practical man, more interested in profit than politics, which gave her hope that he might be willing to make some arrangement about the stable. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and Harold Henderson looked up from the account ledger he'd been working on. He was a portly man in his 50s, with thinning hair and spectacles that perpetually slipped down his nose. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to obvious surprise when he saw Running Wolf behind her. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said carefully, "I heard about what happened at the auction. Quite a surprising development." "Mr. Henderson," Margaret began, then stopped, realizing she had no idea how to explain what she needed. "I was wondering if we might discuss a business arrangement." Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. "What kind of arrangement?" "The stable behind your store. I understand it's not being used for anything at the moment. I was hoping you might consider renting it." Henderson glanced at Running Wolf, then back at Margaret. "Renting it for what purpose?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "For lodging. Temporary lodging until I can make other arrangements." The store owner was quiet for a long moment, studying both of them with calculating eyes. Margaret could practically see him weighing the potential profit against the possible problems such an arrangement might create. "The stable's not fitted for human habitation," he said finally. "No windows, no proper floor, no stove for heat." "We're not asking for luxury," Margaret replied, "just shelter." "And what would you propose to pay for this shelter?" The question she'd been dreading. Margaret clasped her hands together to stop them from trembling. "I was hoping we might work out a trade arrangement. I could do sewing for you, mending and alterations. I know Mrs. Henderson has mentioned needing help with the household linens." Henderson considered this, his fingers drumming against the counter. "My wife does complain about the mending," he admitted. "And business has been good enough that we could use help with inventory and cleaning." Margaret felt a flicker of hope. "I'm very reliable, Mr. Henderson. You know my work." "I do," he agreed. "But ... double quotes." He glanced again at Running Wolf. "There's the matter of him. What exactly is his role in this arrangement?" Margaret looked at Running Wolf, realizing she had no idea what to say. What was his role? She'd bought him at auction, but the idea of treating him like property made her stomach turn. At the same time, she was responsible for him now, and Henderson had a right to know what kind of situation he was being asked to accommodate. Running Wolf spoke before she could answer. "I can work," he said simply. "I know horses, can repair leather, work with wood and metal. I'm clean, quiet, and I don't drink." Henderson's expression shifted slightly, and Margaret could see him reconsidering the situation. Good workers were hard to find in Millbrook, and someone with Running Wolf skills might actually be valuable. "You know horses?" Henderson asked. "I grew up with them. Can shoe them, treat injuries, and train young ones." "And leather work?" "Saddles, harnesses, boots. My grandfather taught me the old ways, but I learned your methods too, at the reservation school." Henderson was definitely interested now. Margaret could see the calculations running through his mind, the profit potential of having skilled labor available, the prestige of being the businessman who'd made a practical arrangement with the Apache warrior everyone else was afraid of. "I might have a use for someone with those skills," Henderson said slowly. "Business has been growing, and I've been thinking about expanding into leather goods and horse equipment." Margaret felt her heart begin to race. Was this actually going to work? What I'm thinking, Henderson continued, is this, Mrs. Sullivan. You can use the stable in exchange for helping my wife with household tasks and mending. Running Wolf, you can work for me in exchange for food and basic supplies. Fair arrangement for everyone. It was more than fair, it was a miracle. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, though she tried to hide them. That's very generous, Mr. Henderson. It's practical, Henderson corrected. I get good workers, you get what you need, and everybody benefits. But I'll need to see the results. This isn't charity. You'll see results, Running Wolf said. And there was something in his voice that made both Margaret and Henderson look at him more closely. Not subservience, but the quiet confidence of someone who knew his own worth. All right then, Henderson said, standing up from behind the counter. Let's go look at this stable and see what we're working with. They followed him through the store and out the back door, past stacks of supplies and equipment to a small wooden building that had clearly seen better days. The stable was larger than Margaret had expected, with room for perhaps 4 horses, though it currently held only Henderson's elderly mare and a collection of tools and feed sacks. I can clear out the far stall, Henderson said. Put up a partition for privacy. It's not much, but it's weatherproof. Margaret looked around the space, trying to imagine making it livable. The dirt floor, the rough wooden walls, the smell of hay and horses. It was a far cry from even her tiny room at the boarding house. But it was shelter, and it was available, and right now that was more than she dared hope for. It'll do, she said. Running Wolf was examining the walls and roof with a practiced eye. The roof needs some work, he said. A few boards are loose, and there's a gap near the back that'll let in rain. But it's solid overall. Can you fix it? Henderson asked. Yes. Good. Consider that your first project. Henderson turned to Margaret. You can start with my wife tomorrow morning. She'll give you a list of what needs doing. As they walked back toward the front of the store, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and apprehension settle over her. She'd solved the immediate problem of shelter, but now she was committed to an arrangement that would tie her life to Running Wolf's in ways she hadn't fully considered. They would be living in the same small space, working together, depending on each other for survival. Mrs. Sullivan, Henderson said as they reached the front door, I hope you know what you're doing. Margaret looked at Running Wolf, who was watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. So do I, Mr. Henderson. So do I. The sun was setting as they walked back toward the stable, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. Margaret found herself walking beside a man she barely knew, who she'd bought for 50 cents, who would now share her makeshift home and uncertain future. The day had begun with her counting coins for bread and ended with her responsible for another human being's welfare. As they reached the stable door, Running Wolf paused. Margaret, he said quietly, I want you to know. What you did today, it wasn't just about buying me. You gave me back something I thought was lost. What's that? She asked. The belief that some people still see Apache as human beings. Margaret felt her throat tighten. In all her worry about practical arrangements and social consequences, she hadn't fully considered what this day had meant from his perspective. You are human beings, she said simply. Not according to most of the men in that square today. They stood in the gathering dusk, 2 people thrown together by circumstances neither had chosen, facing an uncertain future with nothing but hope and determination to sustain them. Margaret thought about the choices that had led her here, about the moment when Running Wolf had whispered her name and changed everything. We'll figure this out, she said, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. Yes, he agreed, we will. The sound that woke Margaret wasn't one she recognized at first. In the gray light before dawn, she lay still on her bedroll, listening to the rhythmic scraping coming from outside the stable. It took her a moment to remember where she was, to recall the events that had led to her sleeping on hay-covered ground instead of in her narrow bed at Mrs. Garrett's boarding house. She sat up carefully, pushing aside the thin blanket Henderson had provided, and peered through the gap in the wooden partition Running Wolf had hastily constructed the night before. Through the stable's open door, she could see him working in the early morning light, using a piece of broken glass to carefully scrape the loose bark from a section of roof timber. 3 days had passed since the auction, 3 days of awkward adjustments and careful politeness. They had established routines around each other, like two strangers sharing a cramped stagecoach, each trying to take up as little space as possible. Running Wolf rose before dawn and worked on repairs until she stirred. Margaret prepared simple meals from the supplies Henderson provided and tried to stay busy with tasks that kept her away from the stable during the day. But watching him now, Margaret realized she knew almost nothing about the man whose life she had purchased for 50 cents. He worked with the focused intensity of someone who found peace in useful labor, his movements efficient and precise. The morning sun caught the bronze of his skin, highlighting the patient strength in his hands as he shaped wood that would keep rain from their heads. She dressed quickly and stepped outside, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. Running Wolf glanced up from his work but didn't speak, a pattern they had fallen into over the past few days. Conversation between them remained stilted, limited to practical matters and basic courtesies. "The roof?" she asked, nodding toward the timber in his hands. "It'll hold through the winter," he replied, setting down the glass shard and examining his work. "But this wood isn't meant for roofing. It's too soft, too green. Won't last more than a season or two." Margaret watched him fit the board into place, testing its stability with gentle pressure. His assessment was delivered without complaint, simply a statement of fact. She had noticed this about him over the past few days. He didn't criticize or demand, merely observed and adapted to whatever circumstances he faced. "You know a lot about building," she said. "Had to learn. On the reservation, if you wanted shelter that didn't fall down, you learned to build it right." He secured the board with a nail Henderson had provided, each hammer blow precise and controlled. "My grandfather taught me the old ways, but the Indian agent made us build white man's houses, so I learned both." It was the longest speech he'd given since they'd started living together, and Margaret found herself curious about this grandfather he'd mentioned, about the life he'd lived before ending up in chains at an auction block. "Was he a builder too, your grandfather?" Running Wolf paused, his hammer suspended mid-swing. For a moment, Margaret thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd overstepped some invisible boundary, but then he lowered the tool and looked at her directly. "He was what you would call a medicine man. But among our people, that means many things. Healer, teacher, keeper of old knowledge. He could cure sickness, but he could also build a shelter that would stand for 20 years, or track a deer across a rock, or make arrows that flew straighter than any white man's bullets." Margaret heard something in his voice when he spoke. Of his grandfather, not just respect, but love. The kind of deep affection that came from a relationship that had shaped who he was at his core. "He sounds like a remarkable man." He was. Running Wolf picked up another board, examining it for flaws. "He died at the reservation. Said the government could move his body anywhere they wanted, but his spirit belonged to the mountains." The simple statement carried a weight of loss that made Margaret's chest tighten. She thought of her own losses, Thomas, their farm, the life they'd built together, and recognized the particular grief that came from watching someone you loved diminish in circumstances that stripped away their dignity. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. Running Wolf nodded, acknowledging her sympathy without dwelling on it. "He taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by what's done to him, but by what he does with what remains." The words settled between them like a challenge, or perhaps an explanation. Margaret realized that in the 3 days since the auction, She had been waiting for Running Wolf to show resentment or anger about his circumstances, to rail against the injustice of being bought and sold like livestock. Instead, he had simply begun the work of making their situation livable, one careful action at a time. "Mrs. Sullivan?" A voice called from the front of Henderson's store, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret recognized the crisp tone of Mrs. Adelaide Garrett, her former landlady. "Mrs. Sullivan, I know you're back there." Margaret's stomach dropped. She had been dreading this confrontation since the day of the auction, knowing that word of her unusual purchase would have reached Mrs. Garrett within hours. The older woman had strong opinions about proper behavior, and Margaret doubted her recent actions would meet with approval. "I should go speak with her," Margaret said quietly. "To Running Wolf. Do you want me to come with you?" The offer surprised her. Over the past 3 days, Running Wolf had made himself as invisible as possible whenever other townspeople were around, understanding instinctively that his presence made situations more complicated, that he would offer to accompany her into what was likely to be an unpleasant confrontation, suggested a willingness to share the social burden of their arrangement. "No," Margaret said, though she appreciated the gesture. "This is something I need to handle myself." She walked around to the front of the store, where Mrs. Garrett stood waiting with the rigid posture of someone prepared for battle. Adelaide Garrett was a woman in her 60s, widowed herself but possessed of sufficient property and social standing to maintain her position as one of Millbrook's arbiters of respectability. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her dark dress was buttoned to the throat despite the morning heat. "Double quotes, Mrs. Garrett," Margaret said, forcing a polite smile. "What brings you out so early?" "You know perfectly well what brings me out," Mrs. Garrett replied, her pale eyes scanning Margaret's appearance with obvious disapproval. "The entire town is talking about your performance at that auction. Have you completely taken leave of your senses?" Margaret had prepared for this conversation, but facing Mrs. Garrett's righteous indignation still made her feel like a child caught in some shameful act. For a moment, she was tempted to offer explanations, to try to make her actions seem reasonable and respectable. Instead, she found herself thinking of Running Wolf's words about measuring worth by what someone did with what remained. "My senses are perfectly intact," Margaret said calmly. "I saw someone in need, and I was in a position to help." "Help?" Mrs. Garrett's voice rose an octave. "You purchased an Apache warrior like he was a piece of livestock. Do you have any idea what people are saying about you?" "I imagine they're saying quite a lot," Margaret replied. "People in Millbrook do enjoy their conversations." Mrs. Garrett's eyes narrowed at the mild sarcasm. "This isn't amusing, Margaret. Your reputation, whatever was left of it, is in ruins. No decent woman would have done what you did." The words stung because there was truth in them. Margaret's reputation had already suffered when she'd been forced to move from her farm to a boarding house, transforming overnight from a respectable farmer's wife to a charity case dependent on the kindness of others. The auction had simply completed her fall from social grace. "Perhaps you're right about decent women," Margaret said. "But I'm beginning to think decency and goodness aren't always the same thing." Mrs. Garrett stepped closer, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. "You're living with him, aren't you? In that stable behind Henderson's store. Do you understand what that looks like?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame but from anger. "It looks like a widow with limited resources making the best arrangements she can. Nothing more and nothing less. Nothing more." Mrs. Garrett's laugh was cold and sharp. "My dear girl, you are hopelessly naive if you think that's how this appears to others. A woman living alone with a savage, sleeping in the same building, sharing meals. The implications are obvious to anyone with eyes." The word savage hit Margaret like a physical blow. She thought of Running Wolf carefully repairing their roof, of his gentle hands and quiet dignity, of the grief in his voice when he spoke of his grandfather. "He's not a savage," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "He's a man who deserves to be treated with basic human respect." Mrs. Garrett's expression shifted from disapproval to something approaching pity. "Oh, Margaret, you poor, foolish child. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, do you?" Before Margaret could respond, the older woman turned and walked away, her spine rigid with moral certainty. Margaret stood watching her go, aware that she had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. Mrs. Garrett would spread word of this conversation throughout Millbrook, and Margaret's defense of Running Wolf would be interpreted as confirmation of the worst rumors. She walked slowly back toward the stable, her mind churning with the implications of what had just occurred. When she rounded the corner, she found Running Wolf exactly where she'd left him, working on the roof repairs as if nothing had happened. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he gripped his tools just a little too tightly. "You heard," she said. Hard not to. He didn't look at her, focusing instead on the board he was fitting into place. "She's not wrong about what people will think." Margaret sat down on an overturned crate, suddenly feeling exhausted despite the early hour. "Does it matter what they think?" Running Wolf set down his hammer and turned to face her. "It matters to you. You have to live in this town. So do you." "No," he said quietly. "I'm just passing through. 7 years, and then I'm gone. You'll still be here, still dealing with whatever reputation I leave you with." The practical truth of his words settled over Margaret like a cold wind. She had been so focused on the immediate problems of shelter and survival that she hadn't fully considered the long-term consequences of her choice. Running Wolf was right. He would serve his 7 years and then disappear back to wherever men like him went when their obligations were fulfilled. She would remain in Millbrook, forever marked as the woman who had lived with an Apache warrior. "Maybe," she said slowly, "I don't want to be the kind of person who makes decisions based on what Mrs. Garrett thinks." Running Wolf studied her face, and she had the feeling he was seeing something there that surprised him. That's a dangerous way to think in a place like this. Everything worthwhile is dangerous. The words came out before Margaret had fully formed the thought, but once spoken, she realized they were true. Every meaningful choice she had ever made, marrying Thomas despite her parents' objections, moving to Arizona territory, standing up to make that first bid at the auction, had carried risks that conventional wisdom would have warned against. "Your husband," Running Wolf said suddenly. "Thomas, what was he like?" The change of subject caught Margaret off guard. In their 3 days of careful coexistence, they had avoided personal topics, sticking to practical matters and surface politeness. "Why do you ask? The way you talk about making hard choices sounds like something you learned from someone else." Margaret considered the question, surprised by how much it revealed about Running Wolf's perceptiveness. Thomas had indeed been the kind of man who followed his conscience regardless of social pressure, who had taught her by example that doing right was more important than appearing respectable. "He was stubborn," she said finally. "Stubborn and kind and completely impossible to argue with when he'd made up his mind about something. He used to say that a person's character was measured by what they did when no one was watching, but I think he was wrong about that. I think it's measured by what you do when everyone is watching and disapproves. Like bidding 50 cents for an Apache warrior, like that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning sun climbing higher and bringing with it the promise of another hot day. Margaret found herself studying Running Wolf's profile, noticing details she had missed before, the small scar through his left eyebrow, the careful way he held his hands when he wasn't working, the silver threads that ran through his black hair despite his relative youth. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded. "Why didn't you try to escape? When they first captured you, or during the weeks before the auction, you could have run." Running Wolf was quiet for so long that Margaret began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, His voice was so low she had to lean forward to hear him. I had run. For 3 years after they moved us to the reservation, I kept running. Every time they brought me back, I'd plan the next escape. I told myself I was fighting for freedom, for my people's way of life. He picked up a small piece of wood, turning it over in his hands as he spoke. But eventually I realized I wasn't running toward anything anymore. I was just running away. And a man who only runs away isn't really a man at all. Margaret felt something shift in her understanding of him, a recognition of the complicated relationship between pride and survival that she had never fully grasped. So you stopped running. I stopped running from things I couldn't change, started focusing on things I could. He gestured toward the repaired roof, the organized tools, the small improvements he had made to their shared space. Like making. Sure, the woman who spent her last 50 cents on me doesn't regret it. The simple statement carried a weight of intention that made Margaret's breath catch. This wasn't just about serving out a legal obligation or earning his keep through labor. This was about repaying a debt of dignity, about proving worthy of the faith she had shown in him. Running Wolf, she said, then paused, realizing she didn't know how to finish the thought. What? I want you to know. What I did at that auction, it wasn't charity. It wasn't some noble gesture to save you. She struggled to find words for the complex mixture of impulse and recognition that had driven her to bid. When I saw you up there, when you said my name, it felt like you were saving me just as much as I was saving you. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and Margaret had the feeling that he understood exactly what she meant, even if she couldn't articulate it clearly. Margaret, he said, and the way he spoke her name with careful respect but also growing familiarity made something warm unfurl in her chest. I think we're going to be good for each other. As if summoned by their moment of connection, the sound of approaching voices drifted around the corner of Henderson's store. Margaret recognized the authoritative tone of Sheriff Coleman and what sounded like at least 2 other men. Her stomach tightened with apprehension as she remembered the bond she still couldn't pay, the legal complications that hung over their arrangement like storm clouds. Running. Wolf heard the voices too and rose smoothly to his feet, his body taking on the alert stillness she had noticed whenever other people were around. But this time, he didn't retreat into the stable or try to make himself invisible. Instead, he moved to stand beside Margaret, not protectively but as an equal prepared to face whatever was coming together. Mrs. Sullivan, Sheriff Coleman's voice called out. I need to speak with you. Margaret stood, brushing dust from her skirt, and walked toward the front of the store with Running Wolf beside her. Whatever was coming, she realized they would face it the same way they had faced everything else in these past 3 days, as partners in an impossible situation, learning to trust each other one careful step at a time. Sheriff Coleman emerged from behind Henderson's store with 2 men Margaret didn't immediately recognize. One was tall and lean with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, his clothes marking him as a government official rather than a local rancher. The other was shorter, stockier, with the weathered hands and suspicious eyes of someone who had spent years dealing with what he considered troublesome situations. Mrs. Sullivan, Coleman said, his tone more formal than usual. This is Agent Morrison from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Deputy Marshal Williams from the Territorial Office in Tucson. Margaret felt Running Wolf tense beside her, though his expression remained perfectly controlled. She understood instinctively that this visit represented a threat to the fragile stability they had begun to build together. Gentlemen, she said, inclining her head politely, what brings you to Millbrook? Agent Morrison stepped forward, removing a folded document from his jacket pocket. He was a man in his 40s with thinning brown hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. His voice carried the clipped precision of formal education and bureaucratic authority. We're here regarding the irregular transfer of custody that took place at your recent auction, he said. There are concerns about the proper procedures being followed in the disposition of captured Apache prisoners. Margaret's mouth went dry. She had feared something like this might happen, but hoping and preparing were different things entirely. What kind of concerns? Deputy Marshal Williams spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly and direct. The kind where territorial law might not have been properly observed. The kind where we need to make sure everyone involved understands their legal obligations. Running Wolf remained silent, but Margaret could feel the weight of his attention as he listened to every word. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he was preparing himself for the possibility of being taken away from their makeshift home. I was under the impression that all proper procedures were followed, Margaret said carefully. Sheriff Coleman oversaw the auction, and territorial statutes were explained to me. That's true as far as it goes, Agent Morrison replied, consulting his document. But there are additional requirements that may not have been addressed. Requirements specific to the transfer of Apache prisoners into private custody. Coleman shifted uncomfortably. Now hold on, Morrison. That auction was conducted according to law. Everything was done properly. Perhaps, Morrison said. But the law requires certain assurances about the capability of private individuals to maintain custody of potentially dangerous prisoners. Mrs. Sullivan, are you aware that territorial statute requires a comprehensive assessment of living conditions, financial resources, and security arrangements before an Apache prisoner can be placed in private hands? Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. No one mentioned any assessment. Because no one expected a woman with limited means to be the successful bidder, Deputy Marshal Williams said bluntly. Most of these transfers involve established ranchers or business owners with the resources to meet territorial requirements. The implication was clear. They believed she was unfit to maintain custody of Running Wolf, and they had come to rectify what they saw as an administrative error. What exactly are you saying? Margaret asked, though she was afraid she already knew. Morrison refolded his document with bureaucratic precision. We're saying that this arrangement may need to be dissolved and the prisoner transferred to more appropriate custody. You mean sold to someone else, Margaret said. Transferred, Morrison corrected. To someone better equipped to meet territorial requirements. Margaret felt anger building in her chest, not just at the threat to take Running Wolf away, but at the casual assumption that her poverty made her unfit to treat another human being with dignity. And who would that be? Samuel Wright has expressed interest in assuming custody, Williams said. He meets all the necessary requirements for financial stability and security arrangements. Margaret remembered Wright's face at the auction, the cold calculation in his eyes as he bid on Running Wolf like he was purchasing a tool. The thought of this man being handed over to Wright made her stomach churn. Mr. Wright withdrew his bid, she pointed out. The auction was concluded legally. Auctions can be voided if proper procedures weren't followed, Morrison replied. Which brings us to the assessment we need to conduct. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his expression troubled. What kind of assessment? Morrison pulled out a second document, this one longer and more official looking. Living conditions, security measures, financial stability, character references, and a demonstration that the prisoner is being properly supervised and controlled. The word controlled hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret glanced at Running Wolf, who was listening to this conversation about his fate with the same calm attention he brought to everything else. But she could see the slight tightness around his eyes, the way his hands were held perfectly still at his sides. When would this assessment take place? She asked. Now, Williams said. We'll need to inspect the living arrangements, review financial records, and observe the prisoner's condition and behavior. Margaret realized they intended to treat this like an investigation, as if she were suspected of some crime rather than someone who had participated in a legal transaction. The humiliation of having her poverty cataloged and judged stung, but what bothered her more was the way they spoke about Running Wolf, as if he weren't standing right there, listening to every word. "Very well," she said. "Where would you like to begin?" Morrison nodded toward the stable. "The living quarters, if you please." They walked around to the back of Henderson's store, the small group moving with the awkward formality of a legal proceeding. Margaret felt exposed and vulnerable as she led them toward the stable, knowing that what they would see would not meet any official standard for proper housing. The stable looked exactly like what it was, a converted animal shelter fitted out with the bare minimum necessary for human habitation. Running Wolf's bedroll was neatly arranged in one corner, Margaret's in another, with the thin partition he had built separating the two spaces. Their few possessions were organized with military precision, but there was no disguising the fundamental inadequacy of the arrangements. Morrison walked slowly around the space, making notes on a pad of paper he had produced from somewhere. Williams examined the partition, tested the stability of the walls, and peered up at the roof repairs Running Wolf had completed. "Is this your sleeping arrangement?" Morrison asked. "Yes," Margaret replied. "And you consider this adequate housing for a prisoner who requires secure custody?" Margaret felt her temper rising. "I consider it adequate housing for a human being who deserves shelter and dignity," Williams snorted. "Dignity doesn't secure dangerous prisoners, Mrs. Sullivan." "Running." Wolf spoke for the first time since the officials had arrived. "What makes you think I'm dangerous?" The deputy marshal turned to stare at him, clearly surprised to be addressed directly. "You're Apache. That makes you dangerous by definition." "I see." Wolf's voice remained perfectly calm. "And what have I done since being placed in Mrs. Sullivan's custody that demonstrates this danger?" Morrison consulted his papers. "The reports indicate you were captured after participating in raids against civilian settlements." "The reports are wrong," Running Wolf said simply. "I was captured because I was in the wrong place when the soldiers came through. I haven't participated in raids against anyone." "That's not what the Army says," Williams countered. "The Army says many things that aren't true." Margaret watched the exchange with growing tension. She could see that Running Wolf was choosing his words carefully, but the official seemed determined to view everything he said as evidence of either deception or defiance. "Regardless of past actions," Morrison interjected, "the current concern is whether adequate security measures are in place to prevent escape or violence." "What security measures do you recommend?" Margaret asked. "Proper restraints during non-working hours, secure sleeping arrangements that prevent unauthorized movement, and constant supervision during all activities." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "You're talking about treating him like a caged animal." "We're talking about following territorial law designed to protect the public," Morrison replied. "Mrs. Sullivan, I understand your intentions may be charitable, but this is not a matter of charity. This is a matter of public safety and legal compliance." Running Wolf turned to look directly at Margaret, and she saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of resigned understanding that this conversation was moving toward an inevitable conclusion. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said quietly, "perhaps these gentlemen are right. Perhaps this arrangement isn't working." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "I mean maybe it would be better for everyone if I were transferred to someone with better facilities." She stared at him, trying to understand what he was doing. Was he giving up? Accepting defeat? Or was this something else entirely? "Is that what you want?" she asked. Running Wolf met her eyes steadily. "I want what's best for you." The answer hit Margaret like a physical blow. He was trying to protect her, trying to spare her the humiliation and legal complications of failing this assessment. He was willing to sacrifice his own welfare to save her from consequences he believed she couldn't handle. Agent Morrison seemed pleased by this development. "You see, Mrs. Sullivan, even the prisoner recognizes that this arrangement is inappropriate." But Margaret wasn't looking at Morrison anymore. She was looking at Running Wolf, at the quiet dignity with which he was, preparing to sacrifice himself for her benefit. And suddenly she understood something that had been eluding her since the day of the tow auction. This wasn't about charity or noble gestures, or proving something to the people of Millbrook. This was about recognizing worth in another human being, and refusing to let bureaucratic convenience diminish that worth. "No," she said firmly. Morrison blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no." Margaret turned to face the agent directly. "Running Wolf is not going to be transferred to Samuel Wright, or anyone else. This arrangement is working perfectly well." "Mrs. Sullivan," Morrison said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone, "I understand you've developed some emotional attachment to this situation, but you must understand the practical realities." "I understand them perfectly," Margaret felt. A surge of confidence she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. "What I don't understand is why you gentlemen are so determined to find problems where none exist." Deputy Marshal Williams stepped forward. "Mrs. Sullivan, this man is a potential threat to public safety. The housing is inadequate, the security measures are non-existent, and frankly, your ability to maintain proper control is questionable." "Control," Margaret repeated. "That's an interesting word. Tell me, Deputy Williams, what exactly do you mean?" "By control? I mean ensuring that the prisoner remains where he's supposed to be, does what he's supposed to do, and doesn't present a danger to the community." Margaret nodded as if considering this. "Running Wolf, would you mind telling these gentlemen about your activities over the past week?" Running Wolf looked puzzled, but answered. "I've repaired the stable roof, organized Mr. Henderson's tool shed, fixed 2 broken saddles, and helped Mrs. Henderson with her garden." "And have you attempted to escape or threaten anyone?" "No." "Have you left the immediate area without permission?" "No." "Have you done anything that could be construed as dangerous or threatening?" "No." Margaret turned back to the officials. "So it seems your concerns about control and public safety are theoretical rather than practical." Morrison's expression had hardened. "Mrs. Sullivan, you're being deliberately obtuse. The law requires certain standards to be met, regardless of current behavior." "Then let's talk about standards." Margaret felt her anger crystallizing into something sharper and more focused. "You want to know about living conditions? Running Wolf has clean shelter, adequate food, and meaningful work. You want to know about security? He's given his word not to run, and his actions prove he's keeping that word. You want to know about supervision? I'm with him every day, and Mr. Henderson can attest to his behavior and work quality." She paused, looking from one official to the other. "What you're really asking is whether a poor widow has the right to make her own decisions about how to treat another human being with dignity. And the answer to that question is yes." Agent Morrison's face flushed with irritation. "Mrs. Sullivan, your emotional arguments don't change legal requirements. If you cannot meet territorial standards for prisoner custody, the arrangement will be dissolved." "Fine," Margaret said, surprising everyone including herself. "Then test us." "What? You want to know if this arrangement works? Then observe it. Stay in town for a week, watch how we live, see how Running Wolf behaves. If at the end of that time you can point to any actual problems rather than theoretical concerns, then we'll discuss alternatives." The officials exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this response. Sheriff Coleman nodded approvingly, and Margaret could see Henderson watching from the door of his store with obvious interest. "A week won't prove anything," Williams said. "A week will prove everything," Margaret countered. "It will prove whether your concerns are legitimate or whether you're simply looking for reasons to overturn a legal transaction because you don't approve of the outcome." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret with new attention. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well, Mrs. Sullivan, 1 week. But understand that we'll be watching carefully, and any sign of problems will result in immediate transfer." I understand completely, Margaret replied. Do you? As the officials walked away, Margaret felt her knees go weak with delayed reaction. She had just committed herself and running Wolf to a week of constant scrutiny, with the knowledge that any mistake could result in his being handed over to Samuel Wright. Running Wolf watched the men disappear around the corner of the store, then turned to look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. That was either very brave or very foolish, he said quietly. Probably both, Margaret admitted. Are you angry with me for not letting you sacrifice yourself? Running Wolf was quiet for a moment, considering her question. No, he said finally. But I'm curious about why you didn't. Margaret looked at the stable they had made into a home, at the tools and repairs that represented their shared efforts to build something worthwhile from impossible circumstances. Because, she said, some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you. Running Wolf nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had known him, he smiled. Not the polite expression he wore when dealing with other people, but something real and warm and full of understanding. Then we better make sure we win this fight, he said. Margaret felt something settle in her chest, a determination that went deeper than stubbornness or pride. They had 1 week to prove that their unlikely partnership could work, 1 week to show that dignity and respect mattered more than bureaucratic requirements. Looking at Running Wolf's steady expression, she found herself believing they might actually succeed. The first test came sooner than Margaret had expected. She was hanging laundry behind Henderson's store when she heard shouting from Main Street, the kind of urgent voices that meant trouble was brewing. Through the gap between buildings, she could see a crowd gathering near the blacksmith's shop, and her stomach clenched as she recognized the hostile energy that preceded violence in small towns. Running Wolf appeared beside her so quietly she didn't hear him approach. He had developed the ability to move like a shadow when he sensed danger, a skill that probably dated back to years of avoiding capture in the mountains. What is it? She asked, though she could already guess the answer would involve them somehow. Billy Crawford's horse, he said simply. It got loose and kicked someone. They're blaming me. Margaret's heart sank. Billy Crawford was the 12-year-old son of one of Millbrook's most prominent families, and his horse was a spirited young stallion that had caused problems before. But she knew that facts would matter less than convenient targets when people were looking for someone to blame. Did you have anything to do with it? I was nowhere near the animal. Running Wolf's voice held no defensiveness, just the calm certainty of someone stating facts. But that won't matter to them. Margaret could see Agent Morrison pushing through the crowd, his notebook already in hand. Deputy Marshal Williams was beside him, his hand resting on his gun. This wasn't just about Billy Crawford's horse anymore. This was about finding evidence to justify transferring Running Wolf to different custody. We need to get over there, Margaret said, untying her apron with hands that trembled slightly. Margaret. Running Wolf caught her arm gently, stopping her forward motion. Let me handle this. Absolutely not. The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended. We're in this together, remember? Whatever happens, we face it together. They walked toward Main Street side by side, Margaret's mind racing through possibilities and explanations. As they drew closer to the crowd, she could see young Billy Crawford sitting on the ground outside the blacksmith's shop, holding his left arm against his chest. His face was pale, but he seemed more shaken than seriously injured. Dr. Patterson was already kneeling beside the boy, gently examining his arm while Billy's mother hovered nearby. Margaret caught fragments of the doctor's assessment, bruised, not broken, more scared than hurt, but the crowd's mood suggested they weren't interested in medical opinions that diminished the severity of the situation. There he is, someone called out as Running Wolf became visible, the one responsible for this. Samuel Wright pushed to the front of the group, his face flushed with righteous anger. I warned everyone this would happen. You can't trust Apache around decent people's animals. They spook them, make them dangerous. Agent Morrison stepped forward, his pen poised over his notebook. Can anyone describe exactly what happened? Several voices began talking at once, each adding details that grew more dramatic with each retelling. Margaret listened with growing horror as the simple story of a horse getting loose transformed into an elaborate tale of Running Wolf deliberately frightening the animal, possibly as some kind of escape attempt. "That's enough," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the babble of accusations. The crowd turned to look at her, some faces curious, others openly hostile. Margaret felt her cheeks burn under their scrutiny, but she forced herself to stand straight and speak clearly. "Billy," she said, addressing the boy directly, "can you tell us what actually happened?" Young Billy looked nervously between his mother and the crowd of adults waiting for his answer. "Well, ma'am, I was getting Thunder ready to ride, and he was acting up something fierce, pawing and snorting and rolling his eyes. Then he just exploded, like something spooked him real bad. Did you see Running Wolf anywhere near your horse before this happened?" Billy shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. I didn't see him at all today. Until just now." Margaret felt a moment of relief, but Samuel Wright wasn't ready to let facts interfere with his narrative. "The boy doesn't have to see him," Wright declared. "Apache have ways of spooking animals from a distance. Could have been using some kind of medicine or scent to make the horse go crazy." The suggestion was so absurd that Margaret almost laughed, but she could see several people in the crowd nodding, as if Wright's explanation made perfect sense. Agent Morrison was writing everything down, his expression suggesting he found Wright's theory plausible. "Mr. Wright," Margaret said, "that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "Is it?" Wright turned to face her directly. "How would you know what Apache is capable of? You've been living with one for less than a week. I've been dealing with their tricks for 20 years. Running Wolf had remained silent throughout this exchange, but now he stepped forward slightly. "May I examine the horse?" The simple request sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Deputy Marshal Williams moved his hand closer to his gun, and several men took unconscious steps backward. "Why would we let you near the animal?" Wright demanded. "So you can finish whatever you started." "So I can tell you what actually spooked him," Running Wolf replied calmly. Dr. Patterson looked up from Billy's arm. "That's not a bad idea. Running Wolf knows horses better than most people in this town. You'd trust an Apache to examine evidence?" Wright's voice dripped with incredulity. "I'd trust someone with expertise to provide useful information," Patterson replied sharply, "which is more than I can say for this mob speculation." Margaret watched the tension build in the crowd and saw how quickly fear and prejudice could transform neighbors into something uglier. Agent Morrison was still taking notes, documenting every hostile word as evidence that Running Wolf's presence posed a threat to community harmony. "I'll examine the horse with him," she announced, "if there are any concerns about safety." Morrison looked up from his notebook. "Mrs. Sullivan, this could be important evidence in determining whether your arrangement poses a public safety risk. Then let's gather the actual evidence instead of listening to wild theories." Thunder was tied to a post outside the blacksmith's shop, still agitated, but no longer in the grip of whatever panic had seized him earlier. The young stallion's eyes rolled white when people approached, and he danced nervously at the end of his rope. Running Wolf approached the animal slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Margaret stayed close beside him, aware that every person in the crowd was watching their every gesture. "Easy, boy," Running Wolf murmured, extending his hand for the horse to smell. "Let's see what's got you so upset." Thunder snorted and shied away initially, but Running Wolf's patient approach gradually calmed him enough to allow a closer examination. Margaret watched as Running Wolf's hands moved expertly over the horse's legs and flanks, checking for injuries or irritation. "Here," he said quietly, pointing to a spot on Thunder's left shoulder. something bit him. Margaret leaned closer and saw what he was indicating, a small inflamed area where something had clearly penetrated the horse's hide. What kind of bite? She asked. Running Wolf examined the wound more closely. Wasp, most likely, or maybe a hornet. See how swollen it is. That's what made him go crazy. Pain and the poison from the sting. Dr. Patterson pushed through the crowd to look at Running Wolf's discovery. After a brief examination, he nodded in confirmation. Wasp sting, definitely. Probably got him right as Billy was mounting up. Would explain this sudden violent reaction. Margaret felt a rush of vindication, but she could see that not everyone in the crowd was ready to accept this simple explanation. Samuel Wright's face had darkened with frustration. How convenient, Wright said. A wasp sting that just happened to occur at the perfect moment to make the horse dangerous. Mr. Wright, Dr. Patterson said with obvious irritation, are you suggesting that Running Wolf somehow trained a wasp to sting Billy's horse at a specific moment? Several people in the crowd began to mutter among themselves, and Margaret could see the mood shifting as the absurdity of Wright's conspiracy theories became apparent. Agent Morrison was still writing, but his expression had grown thoughtful rather than suspicious. Young Billy, Crawford spoke up from where he sat receiving medical attention. Mr. Wright, there's been a wasp nest under the eaves of the blacksmith shop all summer. Pa keeps saying he's going to knock it down, but he never gets around to it. Margaret looked up and saw the nest Billy was referring to, a gray paper structure tucked under the roofline directly above where Thunder had been tied. Several wasps were visible flying in and out, and she could imagine how easily one might have been disturbed and lashed out at the nearest target. Well, Agent Morrison said, closing his notebook with a decisive snap, it appears this incident has a perfectly natural explanation. Samuel Wright's face had gone red with embarrassment and anger. This doesn't change anything, he declared. The fact remains that having an Apache in town creates an atmosphere of tension that makes situations like this more likely. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. Are you actually arguing that Running Wolf is responsible for wasp behavior now? I'm arguing that his presence makes people nervous, makes them jumpy, makes accidents more likely to happen. The only person creating tension here is you, Mr. Wright, Dr. Patterson said firmly. Running Wolf handled this situation with more expertise and professionalism than anyone else present. Deputy Marshal Williams holstered his gun and looked around the dispersing crowd with obvious relief. Seems like everything's under control here, Mrs. Sullivan. Your arrangement doesn't appear to have contributed to this incident. Margaret felt a moment of gratitude toward the deputy marshal, who could have easily used this situation to support Morrison's concerns about public safety. As the crowd began to break up, Running Wolf quietly finished his examination of Thunder, checking to make sure the horse hadn't suffered any other injuries during his panic. Margaret watched him work, noting the gentle competence with which he handled the still nervous animal. You're good with horses, she said when they were finally alone. My grandfather's teaching, Running Wolf replied. He said animals don't lie the way people do. They react to what's really happening, not to what they think might happen. Margaret understood the deeper meaning in his words. Thunder had reacted to a wasp sting, not to some imagined threat from Running Wolf's presence. The horse's honest response had revealed the truth more clearly than all the human speculation and prejudice combined. How many more tests like this do you think we'll face this week? She asked. Running Wolf considered the question seriously. Wright won't give up easily. He's invested too much in proving this arrangement won't work. Then we'll have to make sure we're ready for whatever he tries next. They walked back toward Henderson's store together, past neighbors who watched them with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Margaret realized that their week of scrutiny wouldn't just be about proving they could live together peacefully. It would be about proving they could handle the community's attempts to undermine their success. That evening, as they sat outside, the stable sharing a simple dinner, Margaret found herself thinking about the way Running Wolf had approached Thunder. The patience, the expertise, the refusal to be intimidated by the crowd's hostility, all qualities that were helping her understand why her instinctive bid at the auction had been the right choice. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Running Wolf nodded, setting down his plate. "When you were examining Thunder today, you could have just pointed out the wasp sting and left it at that. But you stayed to make sure he wasn't hurt anywhere else. Why?" Running Wolf was quiet for a moment, watching the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Because treating something right isn't about doing the minimum required. It's about doing what needs to be done." Margaret felt something warm settle in her chest, a recognition that went beyond mere partnership or mutual benefit. This man didn't just work hard or keep his word. He brought genuine care to everything he touched, whether it was repairing their roof or calming a frightened horse. "Running Wolf," she said quietly, "I want you to know what happened today, ... The way you handled It. Thomas would have been proud to know you." The compliment seemed to surprise him, and Margaret saw something flicker across his face that might have been emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means more to me than you might realize." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over Millbrook, each lost in their own thoughts about the day's events and the challenges still to come. Margaret found herself thinking about wasp stings and false accusations, about the difference between what people feared and what they actually faced. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new opportunities for their arrangement to succeed or fail under scrutiny. But tonight, sitting beside a man who treated frightened horses with the same gentle competence he brought to everything else, Margaret felt more confident about their chances than she had since this whole improbable journey began. In the distance, a coyote howled, the sound lonely and wild in the desert night. Running Wolf tilted his head to listen, and Margaret saw him smile slightly at the familiar call. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The wild places?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I'm learning that home isn't always about the place. Sometimes it's about the people who see you for who you really are." Margaret felt her breath catch at the simple honesty of his words. She was beginning to understand that their arrangement had evolved far beyond the legal transaction that had brought them together. Somewhere between the auction block and this moment, they had become something she hadn't expected. They had become family. The realization should have frightened her, but instead filled her with a quiet strength. Whatever Samuel Wright or Agent Morrison or the rest of Millbrook threw at them in the coming days, they would face it together. And that, Margaret thought, made them more formidable than any of their critics imagined. Margaret woke to the sound of Running Wolf's voice, low and urgent, coming from just outside the stable. Gray dawn light filtered through the gaps in the wooden walls, and she could hear other voices responding to his, men she didn't recognize, speaking in clipped, official tones. Her stomach clenched as she realized this was the moment she had been dreading since Agent Morrison's arrival. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Running Wolf standing perfectly still while two territorial marshals flanked him. Agent Morrison stood nearby with what appeared to be a new set of documents, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had finally found the leverage he needed. "Mrs. Sullivan," Morrison said as she appeared, "I'm afraid we have a serious development." Sheriff Coleman emerged from behind Henderson's store, his face grim and apologetic. "Margaret, I'm sorry. Orders came in on last night's telegraph. There's been an incident down in Canyon Ridge." Margaret felt the world tilt around her. Canyon Ridge was where the Army had captured Running Wolf 3 weeks ago, the place where his supposed crimes had occurred. Whatever had happened, there was now being used to justify taking him away from her. What kind of incident? She asked, though her mouth had gone so dry she could barely form the words. One of the marshals, a lean man with silver hair and cold, Blue Eyes answered. Apache raid on a supply wagon. 3 men dead, cargo stolen. Witnesses identified one of the raiders as this man. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. That's impossible. Running Wolf has been here with me for over a week. He couldn't have been at Canyon Ridge. The raid happened 2 weeks ago, the marshal continued. Before your ... arrangement, new witnesses have come forward with positive identification. Margaret looked at Running Wolf, searching his face for some sign of denial or explanation. Instead, she saw the same calm acceptance he had shown at the auction, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. Running Wolf, she said quietly, tell them this is a mistake. He met her eyes steadily. I've never raided supply wagons, Margaret. But I can't prove I wasn't at Canyon Ridge 2 weeks ago. Agent Morrison stepped forward with obvious satisfaction. Which is precisely why this arrangement was inappropriate from the beginning. Mrs. Sullivan, you've been harboring a man wanted. For murder and theft. You don't know that, Margaret shot back. These are just accusations. They're witness identifications from reliable sources, the silver-haired marshal said. That's sufficient for territorial law. Margaret felt panic rising in her throat. Everything they had built together, all the trust and partnership and growing affection, was about to be swept away by accusations she couldn't fight and evidence she couldn't disprove. Sheriff Coleman, she said desperately, surely there are procedures, legal protections. Coleman's expression was painful. Margaret, when federal marshals arrive with territorial warrants, my authority is limited. If these charges are legitimate. They're not legitimate, Margaret interrupted. I don't care what witnesses think they saw. I know this man. He's not a killer. The silver-haired marshal's laugh was cold and dismissive. Ma'am, you've known him for barely a week. You have no idea what he's capable of. I know exactly what he's capable of, Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger. He's capable of gentleness with frightened animals. He's capable of working from dawn to dusk without complaint. He's capable of sacrifice to protect someone else's welfare. Those are the only capabilities I've seen. Agent Morrison consulted. His documents. Mrs. Sullivan, I understand your emotional investment in this situation, but sentiment cannot override legal realities. This man is now wanted for serious crimes and must be transferred to proper custody immediately. Margaret looked around at the assembled officials, seeing in their faces the bureaucratic certainty that allowed no room for doubt or alternative explanations. They had decided Running Wolf was guilty, and her protests were merely the hysterical objections of a woman too naive to recognize danger. Where will you take him? She asked. Territorial prison in Yuma, pending trial, the marshal replied. Standard procedure for violent offenses. Yuma. Margaret had heard stories about the territorial prison, about the heat and brutality that killed men long before their sentences were completed. The thought of Running Wolf in that place made her feel physically sick. How long before trial? Could be months, Morrison said with bureaucratic indifference. Territorial courts have heavy caseloads, and Apache cases aren't typically given priority. Margaret realized they were talking about sending Running Wolf to die in Yuma, while he waited for a trial that might never come, or that would be conducted with the same presumption of guilt these men were showing now. There has to be another way, she said. The silver-haired marshal was growing impatient. Man, this isn't a negotiation. We have our orders. Wait. Running Wolf spoke for the first time since the marshals had arrived, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone turn to look at him. There is another way. Agent Morrison frowned. What are you talking about? Territorial law allows for alternative custody arrangements in cases where the accused has demonstrated reliable behavior under private supervision, Running Wolf said calmly. Mrs. Sullivan has been my legal guardian for over a week. She can vouch for my character and provide surety for my appearance at trial. Margaret stared at him in amazement. Somehow, during their time together, Running Wolf had learned enough about territorial legal procedures to find a loophole that might save him from Yuma. That's actually correct, Sheriff Coleman said slowly. If Mrs. Sullivan is willing to post bond and guarantee his appearance. Absolutely not, the marshal snapped. This man is accused of murder. No private citizen has the resources to provide adequate surety for such charges. Margaret felt her heart sink. Even if the legal option existed, she had no money for bond. No property to offer as guarantee. No standing in the community that would make her surety meaningful. How much bond would be required? She asked anyway. Morrison consulted his papers. For charges of this severity? $500 minimum. $500. The amount was so far beyond Margaret's reach, it might as well have been $5,000. She had spent her last 50 cents to buy Running Wolf at auction, and her current arrangements with Henderson barely kept them fed and sheltered. I don't have $500, she admitted. Then this discussion is pointless. The marshal said, "Step aside, ma'am. We need to get moving." Margaret watched in growing desperation as the marshals moved to flank Running Wolf. In a few moments, they would put him in chains and take him away, and she would never see him again. The injustice of it made her want to scream. "Wait!" A new voice called out. Everyone turned to see Harold Henderson approaching from his store, his usually jovial expression serious and determined. Behind him walked Dr. Patterson, Mrs. Henderson, and several other townspeople Margaret recognized but barely knew. "Mr. Henderson," Agent Morrison said with obvious irritation, "this is official business." "I understand that," Henderson replied. "I also understand that Mrs. Sullivan needs surety for bond, and I'm here to provide it." Margaret felt her knees go weak with shock. "Mr. Henderson, you can't. That's $500. Actually, Dr. Patterson interrupted, stepping forward. "With a document in his hand, we've been discussing this situation, and several of us are prepared to contribute to a bond fund." Margaret stared at the group of townspeople, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. These were people who had watched her auction purchase with disapproval, who had questioned her judgment and whispered about her reputation. "I don't understand," she said weakly. Mrs. Henderson, a plump woman with kind eyes who had barely spoken to Margaret since the auction, stepped forward. "Dear, what you don't understand is that some of us have been watching this past week. We've seen how hard you both work, how respectfully you treat each other, how much good you've accomplished together. The roof repairs on Henderson's store are the finest work I've seen in years," added Tom Miller, the town's carpenter. "And Running Wolf helped my boy when his horse went lame and didn't ask for anything in return." Dr. Patterson unfolded his document. "We've raised $300 in contributions, and Mr. Henderson has agreed to cover the remainder. The bond will be posted, Mrs. Sullivan." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by this unexpected support from people she had assumed disapproved of her choices. Agent Morrison was sputtering with bureaucratic outrage. "This is highly irregular. Private citizens can't simply decide to override territorial law enforcement." "They're not overriding anything, Sheriff," Coleman said firmly. "They're exercising legal options that exist precisely for situations like this. If the bond is posted and Mrs. Sullivan accepts responsibility for ensuring Running Wolf's appearance at trial, then territorial law has been satisfied." The silver-haired marshal was clearly frustrated by this development. "Sheriff, this man is accused of serious crimes. Allowing him to remain in private custody sets a dangerous precedent." "The precedent being set," Dr. Patterson said quietly, "is that in Millbrook, we believe in justice rather than assumption, in evidence rather than prejudice." Margaret looked around at the faces of her neighbors, seeing support where she had expected hostility, generosity where she had anticipated judgment. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that their week of scrutiny had actually worked in her favor. People had been watching, But what they had seen was competence, kindness, and mutual respect. "Mrs. Sullivan," Agent Morrison said, with obvious reluctance, "if you accept legal responsibility for this man's custody and guarantee his appearance at trial, the territorial government will allow him to remain in your care pending judicial proceedings." Margaret looked at Running Wolf, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Accepting this responsibility meant gambling everything on her belief in his innocence. If he ran, if he failed to appear for trial, she would be held accountable for the full bond amount and probably face criminal charges herself. But looking at this man who had spent the past week proving his worth through patient labor and quiet dignity, Margaret realized the choice wasn't difficult at all. "I accept full responsibility," she said clearly. "Running Wolf will appear for trial when required." The marshals were obviously displeased with this outcome, but legal procedures had been followed correctly. Agent Morrison made a show of documenting the bond arrangement and Margaret's formal acceptance of custody, his pen scratching across official forms with bureaucratic precision. "Mrs. Sullivan," Morrison said as he finished his paperwork, "you're gambling your future on a man you barely know. I hope you understand the magnitude of what you're committing to." Margaret looked at the group of neighbors who had stepped forward to support her, at Henderson who had risked his own money, at Dr. Patterson who had organized the bond fund. Then she looked at Running Wolf, who was watching this entire proceedings with the same steady calm he brought to everything else. "Agent Morrison," she said quietly, "I'm gambling my future on a man whose character I've observed every day for over a week. I'm gambling on kindness over cruelty, on truth over convenience, on justice over prejudice. Those seem like good odds to me." As the officials gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Margaret felt Running Wolf move to stand beside her. Not behind her, not in front of her, but beside her as an equal partner in whatever came next. "Margaret," he said quietly, "you didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did," she replied. "Because that's what you do for your family." The word hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went far beyond legal arrangements or practical partnerships. Family, the thing neither of them had expected to find in their impossible circumstances, but which had grown from shared work and mutual respect into something stronger than either had imagined possible. Henderson approached them as the last of the officials disappeared around the corner of his store. "Well," he said with satisfaction, "that was considerably more exciting than I usually like before breakfast. But I'm glad it worked out." "Mr. Henderson," Margaret began, "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Henderson interrupted, with a smile. "Thank me when this is all over and Running Wolf is cleared of these charges. Because that's what's going to happen, isn't it?" Margaret looked at Running Wolf, who nodded once with quiet confidence. "Yes," she said firmly. "That's exactly what's going to happen." As their neighbors dispersed and normal business resumed on Main Street, Margaret realized that something fundamental had shifted in their situation. They were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstances, surviving on the margins of a community that barely tolerated them. They had become part of something larger, supported by people who had chosen to see them as worthy of protection and investment. "Running Wolf," she said as they walked back toward the stable, "are you ready to prove them right?" "I've been ready since the day you bid 50 cents for my freedom," he replied. "The question is whether the truth will be enough." Margaret thought about the witnesses who claimed to have identified him, about the complex machinery of territorial justice that would ultimately decide his fate. Then she thought about wasp stings and false accusations, about the difference between what people feared and what actually threatened them. "The truth will have to be enough," she said, "because it's all we have." But as they settled into their morning routines, Margaret found herself believing that truth, supported by the faith of good people and the strength of an unlikely partnership, might be more powerful than she had ever imagined. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the territorial courthouse in Tucson, her hands folded in her lap as she listened to testimony that would determine Running Wolf's fate. The courtroom was packed with spectators, curiosity seekers, and officials who had traveled from across the territory to witness what newspapers were calling the Apache trial of the century. Judge Harrison Martinez presided from behind an imposing oak bench, his weathered face revealing nothing as witness after witness took the stand. Margaret had learned to read the subtle signs of his attention, the slight forward lean when testimony interested him, the way his fingers drummed against his gavel when he detected inconsistencies. Running Wolf sat beside the court-appointed attorney, his posture straight and dignified despite the shackles around his wrists. The territorial prosecutor had insisted on restraints during trial proceedings, a reminder that in the eyes of the law, he remained a dangerous prisoner regardless of the bond arrangement that had kept him free these past months. Those months had been a strange mixture of normalcy and suspended anxiety. Margaret and Running Wolf had continued their routines in Millbrook, working for Henderson, maintaining their stable home, and proving daily that their partnership functioned smoothly. But always there was the knowledge that this day would come when accusations and evidence would be weighed in a courtroom that operated by rules neither of them fully understood. The prosecutor, a thin man named Clayton with sharp features and an aggressive manner, had spent 2 days presenting his case. Witness after witness testified that they had seen Running Wolf among the raiders who attacked the supply wagon at Canyon Ridge. Their descriptions were detailed, their certainty absolute, their testimony devastating. But Margaret had noticed something that gave her hope. Each witness told essentially the same story, using remarkably similar language to describe events that had supposedly occurred during the chaos of an armed raid. Their accounts were too polished, too consistent, too perfect. Now it was the defense's turn, and Margaret watched as Running Wolf's attorney, a young man named David Thornton, who had taken the case more from idealism than expectation of payment, stood to present their side of the story. "Your Honor," Thornton began, "the defense calls Margaret Sullivan to the stand." Margaret felt her heart jump as her name echoed through the courtroom. She hadn't expected to be called as a witness and hadn't prepared for the scrutiny of formal testimony. But she rose and walked to the witness stand, aware that every eye in the room was following her movement. After being sworn in, she faced Attorney Thornton's gentle questioning about the events leading up to Running Wolf's auction, their subsequent partnership, and her observations of his character and behavior. Margaret found herself describing not just the practical arrangements of their life together, but the deeper qualities she had discovered: his patience, his competence, his unwavering integrity. "Mrs. Sullivan," Thornton asked, "in your opinion, is Running Wolf capable of the crimes he's accused of?" Margaret looked directly at the jury as she answered, "No, absolutely not. The man I know is incapable of senseless violence or theft. He values life too much, respects others too deeply." Prosecutor Clayton rose for cross-examination with obvious relish. "Mrs. Sullivan, how long did you know the defendant before you purchased him at auction?" "I didn't know him personally, but I had met him before. Once? Twice? Briefly? Once, 2 years ago, when my husband and I brought supplies to the reservation." Clayton's smile was predatory. "So you're basing your assessment of this man's character on a single previous encounter and approximately 3 months of cohabitation?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks at his deliberately provocative phrasing. "I'm basing my assessment on daily observation of his actions, his choices, and his treatment of others." "Mrs. Sullivan, isn't it true that you have romantic feelings for the defendant?" The question hit the courtroom like lightning. Margaret heard gasps from the gallery, saw the prosecutor's satisfied expression, felt Running Wolf's eyes on her from across the room. The implication was clear. Her testimony was worthless because she was emotionally compromised. "Mr. Clayton," she said quietly, "I have profound respect and affection for Running Wolf, but my feelings don't change the facts about his character." "Profound affection," Clayton repeated, making the words sound sordid. And these feelings began exactly when Margaret realized she was being maneuvered into admitting something that would undermine not just her testimony, but Running Wolf's entire defense. If the jury believed she was simply a lovesick woman protecting her lover, everything they had built together would be dismissed as romantic delusion. "My feelings began," she said carefully, "when I saw a human being treated as property and recognized that I couldn't stand by and let it happen." Clayton pressed harder. "But surely your personal relationship with the defendant affects your judgment about his capabilities?" Margaret looked out at the packed courtroom, seeing faces that ranged from curious to hostile to sympathetic. In the queue, front row, she spotted Harold Henderson, Dr. Patterson, and several other Millbrook residents who had made the journey to Tucson to support Running Wolf's defense. "Mr. Clayton," she said, finding her voice growing stronger, "you're asking whether caring about someone affects my ability to see them clearly. I think it's the opposite. When you truly care about someone, you see them more clearly than ever. You see their flaws as well as their strengths, their struggles as well as their successes. Love doesn't blind you. Indifference does." The answer seemed to surprise Clayton, who had clearly expected her to become flustered or defensive. Instead, Margaret had turned his attack into an affirmation of the very feelings he was trying to use against her. "No further questions," he said curtly. As Margaret returned to her seat, she caught Running Wolf's eye and saw something there that made her breath catch. Not gratitude or relief, but a deep recognition of what she had just risked by speaking truth in a hostile room. The next witness was Dr. Patterson, who testified about Running Wolf's character as observed in Millbrook, his medical expertise in treating both humans and animals, and his consistent behavior during the months of scrutiny. "Doctor," Attorney Thornton asked, "in your professional opinion, is Running Wolf a violent man?" "Quite the opposite," Patterson replied firmly. "He's one of the gentlest people I've ever encountered. I've seen him calm frightened animals, work with sick children, and handle confrontational situations with remarkable restraint." On cross-examination, Clayton attacked Patterson's credibility by suggesting his testimony was influenced by frontier sentimentality and impractical idealism. But the doctor held his ground, refusing to let his professional assessment be dismissed as emotional weakness. Harold Henderson followed, describing Running Wolf's work ethic, reliability, and positive impact on his business. Then came Tom Miller, who testified about Running Wolf's expertise with horses and his willingness to help neighbors without expectation of payment. But Margaret knew that character witnesses, however compelling, wouldn't be enough to overcome the eyewitness testimony. That placed Running Wolf at Canyon Ridge during the raid. They needed something more concrete, some evidence that would directly contradict the prosecution's case. That evidence came from an unexpected source. "The defense calls Father Miguel Santos," Attorney Thornton announced. Margaret had never heard the name, but she watched with growing interest as an elderly Catholic priest made his way to the witness stand. Father Santos was a small man with kind eyes and hands gnarled by arthritis, his simple brown robes marking him as one of the missionary priests who served the remote communities scattered across the territory. "Father Santos," Thornton began, "where were you on the evening of October 15th? "I was at the San Carlos Reservation, conducting evening services." "And did you see the defendant, Running Wolf, at any time that day?" Father Santos nodded slowly. "Yes, he attended morning prayers, helped with repairs to the chapel roof, and shared the evening meal with our small congregation." Margaret felt her heart begin to race. October 15th was the date of the Canyon Ridge raid, the day when prosecution witnesses claimed to have seen Running Wolf among the raiders. "Father, are you certain of this date?" "Absolutely certain. October 15th was the feast of Saint Teresa. We had special services, and Running Wolf specifically asked me to explain the significance of the day. He was interested in learning about different spiritual traditions. Prosecutor Clayton was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not disclosed during discovery. Judge Martinez looked sternly at Attorney Thornton. Counselor? Your Honor, Father Santos only came forward yesterday when he learned about the trial through newspaper coverage. He traveled here immediately to provide this testimony. I'll allow it, Martinez ruled, but the prosecution will have full opportunity for cross-examination. Clayton's cross-examination was brutal and thorough. He questioned Father Santos's memory, suggested the priest might be confused about dates, and implied that Catholic sympathy for Apache welfare was influencing his testimony. But Father Santos remained unshakable. He produced a detailed journal of his activities, showing clear documentation of Running Wolf's presence at the reservation on October 15th. The San Carlos Reservation was more than 100 miles from Canyon Ridge. There was no way Running Wolf could have been in both places on the same day. Father Santos, Clayton said with obvious frustration, isn't it possible you're mistaken about which day the defendant was at your mission? No, Father Santos replied calmly. I've been keeping detailed records of my ministry for 30 years. Running Wolf was at San Carlos on October 15th, helping us prepare for Santa Teresa's feast. He couldn't have been anywhere else. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she realized what this meant. The prosecution's entire case was built on placing Running Wolf at Canyon Ridge on a specific date, but Father Santos had just proved he was 100 miles away, engaged in peaceful religious activities. Clayton made one final attempt to discredit the priest's testimony by suggesting collusion between the Catholic Church and Apache interests, but Judge Martinez cut him off with obvious irritation. Mr. Clayton, Father Santos's documentation appears thorough and credible. Unless you have specific evidence of falsification, I suggest you move on. The prosecution rested, clearly shaken by the collapse of their timeline. Attorney Thornton made a brief closing argument, emphasizing the contradictions in witness testimony and the solid alibi provided by Father Santos, but it was Clayton's closing that revealed the deeper prejudices at work in the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, you've heard testimony about character and alibis, about Reformed Apache and Christian charity. But let's not lose sight of the fundamental question. Are you willing to trust the words of a Catholic priest and a lovesick widow over multiple eyewitnesses who saw this defendant participating in violent raids? Margaret winced at the crude characterization, but Clayton wasn't finished. This case isn't really about whether Running Wolf was at Canyon Ridge on October 15th. It's about whether we, as representatives of civilized society, are going to allow sentiment and misguided sympathy to override our responsibility to protect innocent settlers from Apache violence. The prosecutor's appeal to racial fear and prejudice was obvious, but Margaret could see from the jury's faces that it was having an effect. Several jurors were nodding, their expressions hardening as Clayton painted Running Wolf not as an individual with rights and dignity, but as a representative of an enemy race. Don't let pretty words about character and reformed behavior cloud your judgment, Clayton concluded. Apache are Apache. Their nature doesn't change because one white woman thinks she can domesticate one of them through kindness. Margaret felt sick at the blatant bigotry, but she also felt something else: rage. Clayton's argument revealed exactly the kind of thinking that had led to Running Wolf being chained and sold in the first place. The assumption that Apache people were inherently violent and incapable of individual judgment. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Margaret spent the time pacing the courthouse corridors, unable to sit still, unable to focus on anything but the knowledge that Running Wolf's life hung in the balance of 12 strangers' prejudices and fears. When they finally returned, Judge Martinez called the court to order with unusual solemnity. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged rancher with weathered hands and serious eyes, stood slowly. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find? Margaret held her breath, feeling as if the entire world had narrowed To this single moment, not guilty. The words hit the courtroom like an explosion. Margaret felt her knees buckle with relief, heard gasps and murmurs from the gallery, saw running Wolf's shoulders relax for the first time in months. On the charge of armed robbery, how do you find? Not guilty. Judge Martinez banged his gavel as the courtroom erupted in conversation. Order. I'll have order in this court. When quiet returned, Martinez addressed Running Wolf directly. The defendant will stand. Running Wolf rose, his dignity intact despite the shackles, his expression calm but watchful. Running Wolf, Martinez said, you have been found not guilty of all charges. The court hereby orders your immediate release from custody and the dissolution of all legal obligations relating to your original auction and bond arrangements. Margaret felt the full meaning of the words settle over her. Running Wolf was free. Not just free from these charges, but free from the 7-year obligation that had bound him to her. Free from all the legal constraints that had shaped their relationship since that day in Millbrook's town square. As the bailiff removed Running Wolf's shackles, Margaret realized she was facing a moment she had been avoiding thinking about. Running Wolf was free to go anywhere, to return to his people, to build whatever life he chose for himself. Their partnership, born from legal necessity, no longer had any formal basis. The thought terrified her. People crowded around them as they left the courtroom, Henderson and Dr. Patterson offering congratulations. Newspaper reporters seeking quotes. Curious spectators wanting to get a close look at the Apache, who had been acquitted by an all-white jury. But Margaret barely noticed the chaos around her. She was focused entirely on Running Wolf, trying to read his expression, wondering if he was already planning his departure from her life. They found a quiet corner of the courthouse steps where they could speak privately. The desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, and Margaret found herself thinking of all the sunsets they had watched together from their stable home. So, she said, trying to keep her voice light, you're free. Yes, Running Wolf replied, but his tone was oddly neutral. You could go anywhere now. Back to the mountains, back to your people. No legal obligations, no restrictions. Running Wolf studied her face carefully. Is that what you want me to do? The question caught Margaret off guard. It doesn't matter what I want. You're free to choose. It matters to me. Margaret felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Running Wolf, I don't want you to stay because you feel obligated or grateful or sorry for me. You've given me more than I ever expected. You don't owe me anything. No, he agreed quietly. I don't owe you anything, but that's not why I would stay. Margaret looked up at him, hardly daring to hope she understood what he was saying. Margaret, Running Wolf said, his voice soft but clear, my grandfather taught me that a man's worth is measured by what he does with what remains. 3 months ago, all I had left was anger and the desire to survive. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. What? The possibility of building something good with another person. The chance to be seen as a man instead of a symbol. Or a threat. He paused, reaching out to take her hands in his. You gave me back my humanity, and in return, I'd like to give you something. You don't need to give me anything. Yes, I do. Running Wolf's smile was warm and real, the expression of someone who had found exactly what he was looking for. I'd like to give you a choice, Margaret. Not an obligation or an arrangement or a legal transaction. A choice. Margaret felt her heart begin to race. What kind of choice? The choice to build a life together. Not because a judge says we have to. Not because circumstances force us to, but because we want to. Because what we've found together is worth choosing every day. Margaret stared at him, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was offering. Running Wolf, are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking you to be my partner in everything. To choose each other freely, with no constraints except the ones we accept willingly. His hands tightened around hers. Margaret, I love you. Not because you saved me from an auction block, but because you see me as the man I am and help me become the man I want to be." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of pure joy. "I love you too," she whispered, "more than I ever thought possible." Running Wolf pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as the desert sunset painted them both in golden light. Around them, the chaos of the courthouse continued, but Margaret was aware only of the steady beat of his heart against her cheek and the certainty that they had found something rare and precious. "So," Running Wolf said softly, "what do you choose?" Margaret looked up at him, this man who had been bought for 50 cents and had proven worth more than all the gold in the territory. She thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the auction, the scrutiny, the trials, the gradual building of trust and respect and love. "I choose you," she said simply. "Every day for the rest of my life I choose you." When they returned to Millbrook a week later, it was as husband and wife, married by a justice of the peace in Tucson, who seemed delighted to perform such an unusual ceremony. The town greeted their return with a mixture of curiosity, approval, and resigned acceptance that Margaret Sullivan had once again surprised everyone. Henderson threw a celebration dinner at his store. Dr. Patterson offered a toast to the triumph of love over prejudice, and even some of the townspeople who had initially opposed their arrangement came by to offer congratulations. As they settled back into their stable home, which Henderson had decided to give them permanently in exchange for Running Wolf's continued work, Margaret found herself marveling at the transformation their lives had undergone. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked one evening as they sat watching the stars appear over the desert. "Staying here instead of going back to your people?" Running Wolf considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "This is where I belong now, with you in this place we've built together." Margaret leaned against his shoulder, feeling the contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. "What do you think would have happened if I hadn't bid that day?" "Someone else would have bought me, and we never would have found each other." Running Wolf's arm tightened around her. "But you did bid, Margaret. You risked everything on 50 cents in a stranger's humanity." "Best investment I ever made," Margaret said softly. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had discovered that freedom wasn't about escaping constraints, but about choosing the ones that made you better than you could be alone. Margaret thought about the girl who had stood at that auction with her last 50 cents, desperate and uncertain and afraid. That girl couldn't have imagined the life she was building now, the love she had found, the family she was creating. In the distance, a coyote called across the desert, its voice lonely and wild. But Margaret wasn't lonely anymore, and the wild places didn't seem threatening when you had someone to share them with. "Running Wolf," she said quietly, "thank you." "For what?" "For being worth 50 cents. He laughed, the sound warm and free in the desert night. "Margaret Sullivan," he said, "you're worth everything I have to give." And as the stars wheeled overhead and the desert wind whispered through the sage, Margaret knew that sometimes the most precious things in life came disguised as impossible choices, and that love was the greatest freedom of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.